The check came back in the mail the same day I was signing his birthday card. I'm Clifford 61, retired controller, been called a lot of things, but never too emotional. Until that call. Light from the blinds hit the brass safe key I hadn't seen in years. Ever lost something before realizing you were supposed to? I was leaning over the kitchen counter with a pen in one hand and a blank birthday card in the other when the phone rang. The pen hovered over the words. Happy birthday, Cassian. With love, Dad, still unwritten when his name blinked across the screen. I smiled reflexively and answered with a gentle, "Hey, son." There was a pause, just long enough to know this wouldn't be casual. "Hey," he replied, voice tight. I won't be coming up this weekend." Something's come up with work. That wasn't the shock. He'd canceled before, always polite, always plausible, but then came the real blow. "Also, Dad, I think it's time we talked about the money stuff. I just don't think you're in the best headspace to handle financial decisions anymore. You've always been emotional." The word echoed. Not angry, not irrational, emotional. As if care, concern, and sacrifice were liabilities on a balance sheet. He didn't say much else before hanging up. No birthday wishes. Not even a thank you for the check I'd already mailed. Just a click and then silence. The kind that lingers in a room long after the phone stops buzzing. I stood there, card still unsigned. I didn't move for a while. The ceiling fan clicked overhead. The scent of oversteeped tea curled from the mug beside me. I thought about how I used to pick Cassian up from piano practice still in my work shirt smelling like copier toner and stale coffee. I thought about the afternoons we spent at Merrill's folk festival booth selling jam and smiling for neighbors. I thought about the check he hadn't cashed last year, the one I sent after we missed Thanksgiving. That envelope had come back too. I walked to the den and opened the drawer where I kept all the return letters. There it was, creased, a red stamp scrawled across the front. Refuse, no forwarding address. I ran my thumb across the edge, already soft from handling. Part of me wanted to believe he never got it. Another part knew better. As I tucked it back into the drawer, something small slipped off the stack of papers and landed on the floor with a soft clink, a brass key. I crouched down and picked it up. Smooth, rounded teeth, a faint mark etched in the handle, S12. I hadn't seen it in years. The key to the old safe. It used to sit in the closet behind the coats. I'd moved it to the garage after Marl left, then forgot it existed at all. It held everything I didn't want to explain. Duplicate documents, the revised will pictures from when Cassian still called me Papa instead of Clifford. I sat there on the rug, fingers curled around the metal. My hand trembled, not with rage or grief, but with a slow, cold clarity. Maybe I had been emotional. Maybe I still was. But emotion, for all its messiness, had never kept me from doing right by him. I wasn't reckless. I was just too full sometimes of wanting things to work. I got up, walked back to the drawer, and reopened it, not to stuff the key away, but to place it on the desk where I could see it. I left the room with the light still on. The next morning, I stood on the curb holding a metal box in one hand and the brass key in the other. The fog hadn't lifted from Eureka's streets yet. The mist clung to the hedges and telephone lines like it was still considering whether to rain again. I crossed the road toward Adelaide Crow's porch. Her house was the kind that smelled like cardamom and carbon paper, lined with old books, broken clocks, and stories too long for any single afternoon. She opened the door before I knocked, wearing a faded green sweater and one of those expressions that read you before you spoke. "Clifford Hughes," she said, stepping aside. "Either you're finally donating that ugly typewriter or this is a guilt visit." I lifted the box. "Neither. I need you to help me open something." She raised an eyebrow. "Is it metaphorical?" I shook my head. "Well, come in before the rain decides for us." Inside, the house hummed with quiet. Her ancient tabby stretched on a radiator tail, twitching like it knew a secret. The air was warm, scented with something between cinnamon and dust. Adelaide led me into the sunroom, which, despite the clouds, lived up to its name. On one side was her typewriter, flanked by teetering piles of paper and a mason jar of pens that had all leaked once and been forgiven. On the other, a tall cabinet labeled City Files. Pre-digital leaned slightly to the left. I'm not sure what I'm doing, I admitted, setting the box on the coffee table. That's never stopped you before, she replied, sitting across from me and reaching for her tea. The key turned with a hesitant click, the lock sticking like it remembered the years. I opened the lid. Inside, everything was still exactly as I'd left it. Manila folders, rubber bands hardened into brittle halos, a photo of Cassian at age 12 cheeks, smudged with brownie mix, and at the very bottom a sealed folder marked Cassian, Originals. I handed it to her. Adelaide didn't open it right away. She looked at me instead. You sure I don't know? That's the problem. She nodded, and with the care of someone handling both paper and memory, she unfastened the clasp. A few documents spilled onto the table, old bank statements, ledger summaries, a handwritten table detailing deposits into the inheritance account year by year. Adelaide flipped through them in silence. You never touched it, she finally asked. Not a cent. Not even when Meryl and I divorced. Not even when the roof leaked in 16. She ran her finger down one of the deposit logs. Steady, disciplined. I thought he'd see that, I said. I thought he'd understand the kind of thing that doesn't show up in parenting books. Adelaide reached for another envelope. It was yellowed at the edges, and as she turned it over, a faint imprint of lipstick glowed against the corner. From Meryl, she asked. Probably 2014. She used to send Cassian little notes, usually with poems or book quotes. She placed it aside gently. You've been keeping everything, Clifford. That's love, but it can also be control. I stiffened. She continued kindly. You know what I mean. Holding on to something too long can look like withholding, especially if the person it's for didn't ask to carry it. I said nothing. I'll help, she added. We'll go through it together, organize what matters, discard what doesn't, maybe even send some of it. There's a revised will in there, I said quietly, never signed. She didn't react, just sipped her tea and said, Truth has a strange way of organizing itself, if you let it. I sat back watching the rain streak down the glass, thinking of everything that had stayed locked up not just in the box, but in my chest. Maybe the key didn't just open the safe. Maybe it opened the part of me that was finally ready to be seen without asking to be forgiven. As Adelaide began sorting through the pages, I stared at the folder marked Cassian, Originals. The paper was starting to fade, but some things stay sharp long after the ink dries. That night, after the windows had fogged and the town settled into its November hush, I pulled the old Royal typewriter from beneath the coat closet. It still worked stiff and loud, like my knees, like my voice, after too many hours of quiet. I placed it on the desk, clearing a circle of space among the tax folders and brittle envelopes. The lamp cast a cone of warm light over the ribbon roller, and the keys clicked out a line that had been circling in my head since the safe opened. If money is all you trust, let me show you how I loved without asking anything in return. I wasn't trying to win him back, not anymore. I just needed to be heard, perhaps for the last time, and not through a voicemail or a lawyer or a forwarded link from Merle. I needed to write it down so that the truth or my version of it wouldn't dissolve when I did. The room smelled like dust and pine polish. The old mantel clock on the shelf ticked once every 8 seconds, broken but consistent. I gathered the materials methodically. There was a satisfaction in it, like packing for a long trip, except the journey wasn't mine. I printed out the ledger, every deposit into the inheritance fund since 2002. I added a color copy of the 2009 bank statement with for Cassian, untouched, written in my own hand. I clipped and scanned letters from Marl, photos of birthdays he'd forgotten, but I hadn't. Receipts from school fees, a confirmation for a scholarship fund he never knew I helped fund behind the scenes. I stacked them like testimony, not for guilt, not for pride, just for record. I slid the revised will between the layers. The signature line was still blank. I wrote a short letter, no flourishes, no explanations, just the facts. A page and a half typed. At the bottom, I signed, "You don't owe me anything, son. But here's what I wanted you to have, if only for the record. Dad." Then I opened the narrow desk drawer and took out a tiny manila envelope. Inside went the brass key. I labeled it in pen Cassian only. A knock on the back door startled me. I opened it to find Adelaide holding a coil of brown string and a small bar of old sealing wax. She didn't say much, just gave me a look that said she understood more than I'd written. We worked in silence. She tied the bundle with care, looping twice around each axis. She lit the candle with a match from her pocket, then warmed the wax and pressed it gently where the strings crossed. When it was done, we sat for a moment. The package rested in my lap like a weight I didn't know I'd been carrying all these years. "Are you delivering it tonight?" she finally asked. "I don't know," I said, fingers still on the edge of the string. "I thought I'd burn it. I almost did. But you didn't." "No," I said, "not yet." We sat there a moment longer before she rose, gave my shoulder a quiet squeeze, and slipped out the door. I held the bundle for another minute, then set it down, went to the closet, and put on my wool coat. The sleeves still smelled faintly of eucalyptus from last winter. At the door, I paused. No farewell, no ceremony, just a whisper into the hallway. "You'll read this or you won't." Either way, it needed to exist. And with that, I stepped into the cold, the parcel under my arm. The key no longer just metal, but something much harder to carry, hope uninvited. The drive to San Jose took just over 5 hours. I didn't call ahead, didn't bring an overnight bag, didn't even pack a sandwich. It wasn't a visit. It was a delivery. A burden wrapped in brown string and sealed with old wax. Early spring had come to the highway in patches purple lupine. Blooming in ditches, a few shy dogwoods showing off in driveways, but it still felt gray to me. Not stormy, just neutral. The kind of weather you forget as soon as it passes. Cassian's neighborhood looked like a real estate brochure, sleek, modern, aggressively symmetrical. Every hedge trimmed, every lawn artificially green. No front steps, just a series of concrete slabs leading to identical doors. His house was easy to find. I recognized the mailbox before I saw the number. But one thing had changed. The garden gnome, Marl, once sent grinning ceramic holding a wooden spoon, was gone. In its place, a small black motion sensor blinking faintly under the eaves. I pulled the car to the curb and turned off the engine. The parcel sat beside me on the passenger seat. I held it a moment longer than I meant to, as if it were suddenly fragile. Then I stepped out, adjusted my collar, and began walking toward the door. My shoes tapped softly on the path. No wind, no birds, just the hum of the air conditioning unit behind the hedges and the muted whir of distant traffic. When I reached the porch, I paused. The doorbell looked more like a fingerprint scanner. I didn't touch it. Instead, I bent down, placed the box directly in the center of the welcome mat, and straightened up. I knocked once, firm but not loud. Then I turned and walked back to the car. Halfway there, I heard its footsteps inside. Quick, cautious. I didn't turn around. The porch camera made a soft mechanical zzz as it tilted, tracking my movement. I imagined Cassian behind the curtains, frowning. Maybe confused, maybe furious, maybe already reaching for the box inside the car. I exhaled, gripped the steering wheel, and started the engine. In the rearview mirror, the house receded into symmetry again. I didn't look back. The drive home felt shorter. I didn't play the radio, didn't stop for coffee. Just followed the familiar curves of Route 101 back up to Eureka. When I stepped inside, the house greeted me with silence. I carried my coat to the hall rack, paused, then turned toward the study. The safe stood open, its shelves empty except for a faint line of dust where the folder had rested. I crouched and ran my hand along the inside edge. Still cold, still silent. Then I closed the door with a slow pull and turned the lock one last time. Click. The brass key now lived in someone else's world. I left the room without turning off the light. The next morning, the red light on the answering machine blinked, an anachronism Cassian always mocked. I pressed play. His voice flat and clipped. I got it. No hello, no thank you, no demand for explanation. Just 3 words, enough to echo louder than the silence that had come before. 2 days after I left the package at Cassian's door, the phone rang. I was standing at this kitchen counter, tea growing cold beside the sink, when the sharp trill split the stillness. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and checked the screen. Cassian. I didn't smile this time. I didn't feel much of anything except a low ache at the base of my neck. I answered on the 3rd ring. You sent a key, he said, skipping greetings. His voice was low-clipped, careful, like someone reciting a warning label. To what, Dad? A cryptic confession, and the wind knocked softly at the kitchen windows. The overhead light flickered once, then steadied. I could almost feel the storm moving in from the bay. "You read it," I said quietly. "I read parts," he shot back. Enough to know what it was, a performance. A staged apology wrapped in old ledger paper. I swallowed. The tea had gone cold. I didn't reach for it. "You think I needed a breakdown in triplicate," he continued. "Receipts for birthdays and tuition like a court case. Who does that?" I breathed slowly, counting each inhale like I used to when he was an infant, and wouldn't sleep unless I rocked him for exactly 10 minutes. "I wasn't trying to manipulate you," I said. "I didn't ask for forgiveness. I only wanted to be heard." He cut in, voice rising. "That's rich. You wanted control, Dad. That's what you've always wanted, even when you were pretending to let go." I leaned my palms on the counter, grounding myself in its chill. "You think sending that package made you brave?" he asked. "It made you cruel. Digging up 20 years of dust and guilt and calling it clarity. I didn't send it to reopen wounds, but you knew it would." Silence stretched. The light flickered again. "You broke something," he said at last. Voice suddenly tired. Something that was already cracked. Then the line went dead. I didn't move at first. The dial tone faded, and I set the phone down beside the tea, its surface slightly damp with condensation. And then my body did something strange. It didn't tense, it didn't collapse, it simply let go. I slid down the side of the cabinet and sat on the kitchen floor, the towel still balled in my hands. Not out of grief, not even anger. Just an exhaustion so complete it left no room for anything else. He had the right to feel what he felt. I'd spent so long organizing pain into neat categories that I'd forgotten how messy it was in someone else's hands. I stared at the floor tiles, faded blue, one of them cracked like a lightning bolt. It had been that way since Marl left. I always meant to replace it. A rustle by the window pulled me from my thoughts. Then 3 sharp knocks at the back door. I stood slowly, knees stiff. When I opened it, Adelaide stood there, still in her brown coat, phone in hand. "Clifford," she said, not bothering with preambles. Cassian just called Ellis. My stomach tightened. He's disappeared. It was nearly midnight when I heard gravel shift in the driveway. Not the sharp crunch of a delivery van or the soft glide of a neighbor's hybrid. This was slower, heavier, measured. I knew that walk, even after all these years. I turned off the stove and let the fire settle into quiet crackles. The house felt unusually still, like it too was holding its breath. When the knock came, it wasn't loud, just 2 soft taps. I opened the door, and there he was, Cassian, hair damp from the mist shadows under his eyes like smudged fingerprints. He held the package under one arm, the brass key pinched delicately between his fingers, like it might sting. "You're awake," he said flatly. "I figured you might come." He stepped inside without being asked. Droplets clung to his jacket sleeves, and his shoes left a trail of water across the rug. He tossed the package onto the coffee table without care. The wax seal had cracked. Then quietly. Why now? I sat on the armrest of the couch, hands clasped. Because I realized silence was betrayal too. Cassian laughed. Not warmly, silence. "You think you've been silent? You mailed me a dossier. You dropped a brick of ghosts at my door." I glanced toward the fireplace. The cocoa I made earlier still steamed faintly untouched. "You knew," he said. "About Mom, about Ellis, about all of it." I looked up. "You knew, and you waited. You made it my job to discover everything at once, like some final exam on trust." "I didn't want to weaponize pain," I said. "But maybe I did. I don't know anymore." He paced once, twice. "Then you ruined her for me. You made me question every good thing I remembered. That was never my intent. But you did it anyway." I folded my hands tighter. "I was never brave enough to tell you what you meant to me. That's on me." He stared at the key. This was your love letter, a brass key, and a stack of PDFs, so," I said. Voice thin. "It was a last resort." Cassian looked around the room, the tilted photo on the mantel, the frayed arm of the chair he used to climb on as a kid, the quilt Meryl's mother had sewn. everything familiar and yet foreign. Then he stepped forward, placed the key on the table gently, but with finality. "Take back your vault of truth," he said. And with that, he turned and left. The door clicked shut behind him. His footsteps faded into the mist. I sat for a moment unmoving. Then slowly I rose, walked to the study, and opened the safe again. It creaked a little louder than usual, as if protesting the cycle. Inside, where I thought nothing remained, lay a single item, the last photo of Cassian as a child. The one from the camping trip before Merle left. His smile uneven, a marshmallow on his chin. The corner was torn slightly but unmistakably. I held it gently between my fingers. Sometimes the paper wears before the memory does. News travels fast in small towns. Whispers move quicker than cars. That Monday, Adelaide told me what I hadn't had the courage to ask. Cassian quit his job, she said, pouring tea into a chipped blue cup. And from what Ellis says, his wife took their daughter back to Santa Rosa last weekend. I didn't say anything. The tide was already pulling in too many directions inside me. The fog had thickened that morning, curling around Eureka's boardwalk like old breath. I'd walked the shoreline early, not expecting peace, just movement. My boots left barely visible marks in the wet sand, like the kind of impact you hope you've made but can't prove. In the afternoon, I stopped by the pantry where Adelaide volunteered. We pretended I was there for potatoes, but she handed me an envelope. "I found this on Ellis's printer," she said. It wasn't mailed. Inside was a single page, typed, short. I should never have opened that box. It broke more than it revealed. No signature, but the voice was unmistakably his. Back home, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The window hummed with early summer haze. I pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began writing. The second letter was softer, less proof, more apology. I told him the inheritance was still untouched, still his, but I no longer believed money had anything to say that people couldn't. I wrote 3 pages, then I folded them neatly, tucked them in an envelope, and burned it in the kitchen sink. Some things aren't meant to be reopened. Some words do more healing when they stay unsaid. That night I baked. Flour dusted the counters like early frost. I peeled the apples, slowly slicing thin, the way he used to like them. Sugar, cinnamon, a little lemon zest. The scent filled the house like old music. When the tart came out of the oven, I placed it on the table beside a folded napkin, the one with his childhood scribble still faintly visible, a jagged star, and the word Dad in shaky block letters. I didn't eat it. I didn't wrap it. I just let it cool in the quiet. The next morning I found the key. It sat in the mailbox alone. No note, no envelope, just metal slightly tarnished, faintly warm from the sun. I held it in my palm for a while, then drove to the church pantry. No one stopped me as I slipped it into the donation box, near the front under a folded slip of paper. I wrote just one line, for anyone who needs to open what's hard to say. And that was all. A year later, I signed away my son's inheritance in a lawyer's office that smelled faintly of toner and lemon wipes. No ceremony, no flourish, just a signature that didn't shake. The room was clean, efficient gray file cabinets, a wall clock that ticked louder than necessary. The attorney, a woman in her 40s with a voice like corduroy, handed me the last form with a polite nod. "This finalizes the redistribution," she said. "You understand the terms, I do." With one stroke of ink, the account that had waited decades for a reconciliation now had a different name, the Intangible Fund. It wasn't large by modern standards, enough for a few workshops, some printed flyers, modest grants for counseling. But I'd spent most of my life believing love had to be earned with numbers. It was time to stop counting. I walked out of the courthouse alone. The breeze carried a hint of sea salt and something older, maybe eucalyptus. On the bulletin board in the hallway, a new flyer caught my eye. Rebuilding Family Trust After Silence. Free weekly sessions, led by Adelaide Crow. The photo was small but unmistakable. Her trademark gray scarf, her half smile that never apologized for knowing too much. I didn't attend the first session, or the second, but I showed up for the third. The community center was modest, its chairs mismatched and creaking. Someone served hot cider in recycled mugs. A hand-lettered sign over the entrance read, What isn't spoken still speaks. I sat in the back, said nothing, just listened as Adelaide introduced a breathing exercise, and someone cried quietly 3 seats over. At the end, I helped stack the chairs. Over the next few months, I began volunteering anonymously at first. I rewired a faulty wall heater, set up folding tables, brought fresh bread to the pantry. Never mentioned Cassian. Never used the word legacy. One afternoon, Ellis asked if I'd mind tightening the plaque on the new therapy room door. I brought my screwdriver and noticed the engraving for the first time. This room is made possible by someone who learned too late, but gave anyway. I didn't know who wrote it. I didn't ask. In late 2024, I had a conference to attend in Mountain View. On the way back, I passed through San Jose. Cassian's house was the same sharp lines, perfect hedges. But this time, the lights were on. Through the window, I caught a glimpse of movement. Someone, maybe him, was at the piano. I couldn't hear the music, but I recognized the shape of the posture. Elbows slightly raised. The same way he sat as a child, mimicking Marl. I didn't stop. Didn't knock. Just kept driving, whispering to the windshield. Some legacies aren't built with money. Just the courage to stop lying. The road home shimmered under the dusk. No map. No promises. But for the first time in a long while, no burden in my hands. The community center smelled faintly of hot cider and old pine. On the shelf near the exit, someone had left a brass key, polished, resting gently beside a note card that simply read, "Not all locks are meant to hold things in." I didn't need to take it home. I already had my answer. Sometimes we wait too long for the perfect reconciliation and forget that imperfect grace still heals. You don't have to win back what was lost. Just stop letting it define you. Has life ever handed you a second chance in disguise? Feel free to share your story or stay and read a few. And if you'd like more moments like this, you're always welcome to follow the journey.